It would need to exist by the time of the Exodus, because that's when the Bible says Moses was living and writing the early books. It would have to be available in the region of Egypt, because that is where the Bible places Moses and the Israelites in the centuries before the Exodus. And it would need to be a form of writing, like Hebrew, that Moses could have used to write the Torah, because that was the language of the early Israelites. Patterns are powerful tools, because they demonstrate a sequence of information. A sequence is much stronger than one random piece of data, and I had learned that to find a pattern in history, you would need all the pieces to fit together. One reason there is a debate over whether Moses could have written the Torah is because the original documents have not survived the many centuries down to today. So, what are the oldest copies we have, and how close are they to the time of Moses? I traveled to the Dead Sea in Israel, where in the 1940s and 50s, the oldest known copies of books from the Bible were discovered. They were called the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were written in Hebrew, the language of the early Israelites. Dr. Randall Price was the director of excavations at Qumran for 10 years. In January of 2017, he was a part of the discovery of a new cave at Qumran, the first new cave in over 60 years.
Here we also found part of the top of a juglet and of a cooking pot, indication this cave was used.
They found the remains of jars placed in niches, but the scrolls had been taken. They hope to find more caves with new evidence in the years ahead. I asked him about the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Now with the Dead Sea Scrolls, not only do we have this history brought to life with all these various documents, but we have every copy, every book of the Old Testament except for Esther. But Esther is mentioned in some of the texts, so we know they must have had it represented. And so we have the oldest copies of the Bible that we know.
The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls puts the date at around 200 BC for the oldest copies of books from the Bible that have been found. If the story of the Exodus originated earlier than this, the question is, how much earlier? If mainstream scholars don't think Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, when do they think they were written?
My thinking is it was written during the Persian period, which would put it probably in the 5th to 4th century BC.
So not back as an eyewitness account.
I don't think so. There's no evidence for that.
If the early books of the Bible weren't written until this time, then that's a big problem for the validity of the Bible's claims. A colleague of Professor Peter Gentry is Professor Duane Garrett. He is the distinguished John R. Sampe Professor of Old Testament at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Professor Garrett authored Rethinking Genesis and has written commentaries and other books on the development of the Bible. Do you think that Moses wrote the Torah?
Moses did write it. There are things in the Pentateuch, such as the death of Moses. The Pentateuch doesn't claim that Moses wrote his own death. And so I don't think that's a problem. But if you look at the fact that the laws are crucial and are central to the Pentateuch, and that those come from Moses, then certainly it is fair to say Moses is the author, the source of the Pentateuch.
When I was filming William Deaver, he was very adamant that really no one believes that Moses wrote the first books of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to that?
Well, when you speak of mainstream scholarship, it depends upon how you define the term. If you define it by a fairly exclusive club of university scholars, basically they're right. But of course there are plenty of evangelicals who have looked into the issue and continue to hold to the Mosaic origin for the Pentateuch. So it just depends on how you define the term.
In 1979, southwest of the old city of Jerusalem, an archaeological team headed by Gabriel Barkai uncovered two tiny scrolls made of silver. They fit into an ancient amulet that was hung around the neck. When the scrolls were carefully unrolled, they revealed Hebrew writing, including a passage from the book of Numbers. It was the famous blessing Moses gave to the priests.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
The wording exactly matched what is found in modern Bibles. After testing, it was found to be the oldest surviving text of a biblical passage, and it was dated to 600 BC, which is 400 years earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, and more than 200 years earlier than when Professor Knight thinks the first Torah was written. So I asked him why he thought Moses couldn't have written the Torah back at the time of the Exodus.
Even though writing was possible, most people were illiterate.
Well,
And so who would have written it and for whom? There is no reading public that's out there waiting for the next installment.
It was clear that this issue of when widespread literacy was possible is important.
The context in which this literature first came into existence was in oral traditions that were being passed on from one generation to the next. Stories that you would tell your children, and it would be, and they would then tell their children. And these stories are not unchanging as they pass on in time. You embellish, you enhance, you connect, and pretty soon then you might end up with a larger saga of materials. These oral traditions really are the seedbed for what later on became written text.
The thinking is that if Moses didn't write at the time of the Exodus, then this part of the Bible and its account of God giving revelation to mankind was an oral tradition and more vulnerable to changes and exaggerations with each telling of the story. And if that happened, it would no longer be a trustworthy account. But surely, widespread literacy wasn't required for Moses to write the Pentateuch, since scribes in Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia wrote all the time without a large reading audience. However, as I read the book of Deuteronomy, I saw that a wider literacy was essential for the Israelites to understand and preserve the revelation given to them in the books of Moses. It recorded that Moses told the heads of Israelite households to write the words of the law on the doorposts of their homes and on their gates, so they could teach them to their children. What I know so far is that the Bible is claiming that Moses wrote and that there was literacy among the Israelites. We may never know how widespread it was, but because of the perishable nature of the writing material, it's not surprising that we haven't found much evidence of writing, including books of the Bible, from the early part of Israel's history. If Moses wrote the Torah, was there a suitable writing system as early as 1450 BC? I went to Egypt to meet Egyptologist David Rohl. He has written Exodus, Myth or History, in which he lays out evidence for the sojourn, exodus, and conquest at the earlier date. I asked David to help me understand how writing developed in the ancient world.
Wow, look at these. Well, these reliefs are absolutely perfect.
They're gorgeous, aren't they?
Yeah, is it a tomb or a temple?
This is actually a chapel above a tomb. The tomb is actually below us down here. But what we're standing in is the chapel above the tomb. And it's covered in hieroglyphs. This is the cartouche of the god's wife, Ameneidis. And you always read hieroglyphs looking into the animals. So you face towards the animal, like the snake here and culture here. So you're reading from left to right in this case, and then from top to bottom.
And is this a story, a narrative, or what does all this say?
No, they're spells and incantations and things like that. And they mention the person and what she must do to enter the underworld, to pass into the other life.
David went on to explain to me that writing actually existed long before the Exodus in forms such as hieroglyphics in Egypt and cuneiform in ancient Mesopotamia, which was in the area of modern-day Iraq. But were hieroglyphics or cuneiform a suitable writing system that Moses could have used to write the Torah? As I thought about it, the writing system also had to be simple enough for the Israelites to read what was written, as Moses commanded. Unlike the alphabet, cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics had nearly 1,000 signs. They were so complicated to learn that only the scribes, priests, and kings could use them. In contrast, our alphabet today has 26 letters. Imagine how much harder it would be to have to learn 4 of our alphabets rather than 1. But to learn hieroglyphics, one would have to learn the equivalent of 40 alphabets. That's one thing that made the alphabet so revolutionary. And with a simple to learn yet powerful alphabet, it would have been possible to teach large numbers of Israelites to read and write. With a non-alphabetic system, this would have been impossible.
In Egyptian schools, they had lists of names, onomastica, and that sort of thing that went on forever, hundreds and hundreds of things that the kid would have to memorize. But not with an alphabet. You can simply use the 26 signs and that's it.